This is Sri Lanka. Previously Ceylon, it was once an important part of the British Empire. A variety of lucrative crops were grown here. This is cinnamon. Its production was sponsored by the British in Ceylon, as well as other crops such as cinchona, which was used to make an anti-malarial called quinine, which they put in their gin and tonics, and also coffee, which was the main and most lucrative crop in Sri Lanka, until 1870, when a blight devastated the plantations. By 1880, there was a new crop, which was beginning to dominate the plantations of Sri Lanka. Tea. My name is Tom Rousell. I'm English, so of course I love tea, but I never realised I had a personal connection to its production in Ceylon until I began researching my family on the internet. I found out that my great-grandfather, Veer Rousell, was born in Ceylon, but I had no idea why. It turned out that his father, Norman Rousell, had moved to Sri Lanka in 1880, right at the start of the new tea planting boom, which he had got thoroughly involved in. His brother Eustace was also a planter, as were his wife's family, the Congreves. My great-great-grandmother Florence was a Congreve, and her nephew, Richard John Congreve, was also a tea planter. I found out that he had children with his common-law wife in Sri Lanka, and that his line still survived there. When I got in touch with my long-lost Sri Lankan cousin, I learned that he lived and worked in the tea planting district and is an expert on tea. He has invited me to visit his family and see the tea plantations myself, so please join me on this personal journey to learn about Ceylon tea and my own colonial heritage. I'm headed to the Nawara Aliya district in the central highlands of Sri Lanka. This is where my family lived and where most of the tea was grown.
Welcome home, Tom.
My long-lost cousin Kenneth is a professional tea taster. He visits the factories on the estates and makes sure the tea is of a suitable quality for the exporting companies. Not only is he my relative, but he is also the best person to speak to in order to understand the tea industry in which my ancestors worked years ago.
I started in 1980, so it's been 36 years.
And you carry on where your father had been before?
No, my father was a tea planter. So his career was quite different to mine. Because I'm a tea taster and I worked for tea export companies. The estates where my father worked, they were owned by English or Scottish people. We were well aware that the tea industry was strongly linked to the British Empire.
Nice.
Now that's dust number 1. It's a small grade. Now you will find that this is lighter. You just taste it. You take the spoon and
It's slightly sharp on the side of the tongue.
Okay.
I prefer it, this one, yeah.
Okay. Right. Yeah, you're a plain tea drinker?
This one has something else in it extra than that.
Yeah.
Stronger.
Yeah, it's just stronger.
Body.
These leaves have been crucial to Sri Lanka's economy for 150 years, but the tea industry is now in decline.
Yes, I would agree that there is a decline because I think that has mainly been brought about by the decline in the labor, the number of workers who are available now for the performance of their normal duties on the estates.
But even now, a lot of people work over a huge area of the country which is devoted purely to the growing and processing of this tea, to the extent that the name Ceylon is synonymous with this plant. The highlands here, where the tea grows, where the highest quality tea grows, was of course a wild place before the British came. The great civilizations of Ceylon were down in the plains. The hills were under great interest to the ancient Sinhalese people. I've come here from England, and it was hotter in England than it is here. It's humid, but just a really pleasant 22 degrees with a cool breeze. I can see why the English wanted to set up shop here, because it's really the most agreeable climate. What would you say the general Sri Lankan attitude is to the legacy of the British Empire and to the memory of the British?
Well, I would say the more nationalistic people, they try to find fault with everything the British did, that they took so much out of the country, which is true. But on the other hand, they also left so much behind, because if these tea plantations weren't opened up, originally the coffee plantations and then the tea plantations, I really wonder what might have been done with the land. And the roadways, the railways, all that helped to open up the country, the hill country particularly.
Three years ago I came to Sri Lanka, and I knew that my family had been involved in India. Good morning. Good morning. I knew that my family had been involved in India, but I didn't know exactly that we'd been involved in tea plantations. I thought maybe it was coffee planting in Burma or something, because these stories get told about your ancestry and they change a bit and no one remembers it properly. But as I travelled along this very railway that I'm standing on now, I took a train from the mountain town of Ella through the tea plantations up to the city of Kandy. Many hours on the train. About 4 hours into the journey perhaps I would have gone past this spot where I'm now standing, and I remember thinking what a beautiful part of the world this was, these tea plantations, and feeling strangely as though, well, I kept on thinking about my ancestors and I kind of wanted to believe that they were actually planters in Sri Lanka. And it wasn't until later that I found out that they actually were, and that the train that I was on had actually gone right through past a lot of the places that they'd lived, and I felt so strangely like an ancestral voice was calling to me on that train journey, which I assure you cannot be explained, because I did not know, no one in my family had ever mentioned any family connection to Sri Lanka, only to India. If you're ever in Sri Lanka, I highly recommend you take the train, because it's one of those things the British left that is just a marvellous experience. The train tracks are the same as they always were, and the journey, it just goes through these mountains, past waterfalls and tea plantations, and it's quite incredible. It may surprise you to learn that a great many of the plantations in Sri Lanka, the tea plantations, are under the influence of a man in New York by the name of Katz. That's because he is the founder of the Rainforest Alliance NGO, and they dictate what must be done on these plantations in order for them to qualify to have the Rainforest Alliance sticker on the tea that you buy in the supermarkets. It's a little frog, you may have seen it. The rainforests themselves have not been here for a very long time, so I think it's really just about making sure people don't spray wrong chemicals and things like that down. But it's not the first time that a Jew has had an overwhelming influence on this part of the world. Because, as I said previously, the British had originally been planting coffee. One of the first pioneers in tea in this area was in the 1860s a Scottish man by the name of Taylor. He's widely recognised as being a pioneer for tea planting. But another one, a more rich couple of individuals, were the de Worms brothers, two German aristocrats whose mother was a Rothschild. And they had the largest estate on this in Sri Lanka, the largest tea estate. And they were also very early investors in tea. Their estate was not called the Worms estate, it was called the Rothschild estate. And it was very big indeed. The real tea industry didn't get kick-started properly until 1880. Tea was just one of many plants that were grown here. But it was over the course of the following 10 years, it switched to tea. And so in that sense, the Rothschilds and Scottish Taylor, they were, ahead of the curve. The Congreves are a very old, noble English family whose roots go back to the Norman Conquest. I was always taught to be very proud of my Congreve ancestry, and it seems Kenneth is too. Here you can see that the Congreves are mentioned in the Domesday Book. They are also listed in the Ceylon Directory of Planters' Families.
I worked out that the people who are underlined are the ones who are in my direct line,
And they're all in my direct line as well.
Okay, yeah.
You're descended from his son George Whitaker, from Richard Jones Congreve's George Whitaker, while I am descended from his daughter Florence Henrietta, who married Norman Rousel of Southern India Planters Association.
Yeah.
The dramatist, the famous playwright William Congreve, who I'm not a direct descendant of. Are you?
No.
Are we descended from his brother?
Yes. No, from his uncle.
From his uncle. Oh, I see. Heaven hath no rage, like love to hatred turned, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned. So this fellow is a Congreve and a Rousel. His mother.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
His grandfather was Norman Rousel.
Yes.
And his mother was Esme Rousel, the daughter of Norman.
That's right. Yeah.
And she was married to her cousin Cecil Ralph Congreve, and her mother was also a Congreve.
Yeah.
And he was Lieutenant Colonel of the Sea Squadron of the 7th Hussars in the Battle of Sidi Rezegh in Libya. Because Congreve was in his element in this mobile battle, in which speed of thought and shrewd judgment were vital. He would also maintain high morale. Isn't the Congreve, what's the Congreve motto for something like, he wins fame,
something like
he never dies who wins fame in life. This church behind me was built 1 year after my great-grandfather, Vere Norman Rousel, was born, just on the other side of the valley. It served for the British community in this area, the planter community, as a focal point. You come here and worship. The bells would ring out across these hills, and it probably felt a lot like England. In fact, looking at this old Gothic-style church, it really does feel strangely as though we're in Britain, but we're in the middle of a tropical country, south of India. Quite an odd sensation. The community of the planters were generally quite conservative. If you moved here as a planter, you had to play cricket with the planters, you had to join the clubs, you had to worship in the right church, and there was a strong sort of bond between them. Excluding the natives,
and you were expected to kind of fit in. When any planters came who didn't fit in, it created a lot of problems, and especially when those individuals try and mingle too much with the natives, because that upset the planters.
Major General Sir Hector MacDonald did exactly that and ended up committing suicide in 1903 after the planters accused him of homosexual activity with the local boys. Now I'm off to visit a local sports club founded by British planters in 1868 and of which my ancestor Norman was the honorary secretary and treasurer and captain of the rugby team. Norman and his brother would have come here to drink and play rugby with the other planters. To my surprise and delight, I discovered that they still have photos of my relatives hung on the walls. 1895, and this is
1894. This is the oldest one.
Okay.
Yeah. So here are the two rows of boys.
Oh wow! I see them playing their rugby there, and it says Norman Rousell's captain. Was that taken at this club?
Apparently not. I think it has been. It's Upcountry versus Colombo, so it may have been taken in Colombo.
I see.
Yeah.
And this...
Then I think this is the next one, right? The next oldest one is this, and Eustace.
The following year.
The following year appears again, right? That's it.
The big tash.
Yes, that's it.
At the front.
Then here they've changed. The Colombo team have.
Oh no! Oh, that's Colombo.
Yeah.
And then Norman's the captain. Oh no,
the referee.
Yes, the referee.
Yeah. That's it.
Standing in with a very small tie. What was this club used for in those days?
It was mainly a sports club, but it was also the center of the social life in the district.
Yeah.
Because the people used to all come down here for sport and also the bar, right? And there was this badminton court, and there's a squash court across the road there, and there are tennis courts on the other side. So there was a lot of sport played.
Badminton, rugby, cricket, squash. Was football played then as well?
May have been, but it wasn't particularly popular. Yeah, it was more rugby that planters played.
And was there a connection with hunting? They used to...
Yeah, well, there must have been plenty of game around the area.
Yeah.
So
I guess these were shot in the
yes,
as well.
And it must have been the planters of the club who shot these animals anyway.
So they could boast about them over their brand.
Yeah, while sitting at the bar, I suppose.
Yeah. It's really...
and it's quite a big repertoire, really.
Yeah. And this club has been in continuous use for sports and socialising since those times.
It continues to this day.
Very well preserved. Is it supported anyway by the state or
No, certainly not. It's just a private club, and it is the membership fees which carry it through. You know.
Are you a member?
I used to be, but no longer. Not since I moved to Colombo.
When they weren't playing sports, planters had a hard life managing the estates, but not as hard as those of the coolies who worked for them. Then, as now, there were labour shortages. So after 24 years as a planter, Norman had to move to India in 1904, where he was charged with recruiting more Tamil workers for the tea plantations in Ceylon. Do you think that people like my ancestor Norman Rousell are involved in the importing of Tamils? Do you think that labour policy had led to... it means the British are partly responsible for some of the conflicts that happened
No, I think what happened there was that they actually found that they couldn't get sufficient work out of the Sinhalese who were available, you know, and they were just not willing to work the hours that were required and put in the amount of hard work that was necessary to start and run these plantations. So they had to get the labor from somewhere. I suppose India was the closest and the cheapest place to get it from.
This is the Abbotsleigh estate, on which Norman worked for over 2 decades. He and his wife lived in this bungalow. My great-grandfather, Vere Rousel, was probably born in this very room. This is the view he would have enjoyed as a boy. He was an assistant to my great-great-grandfather due to his work at the Ceylon Labour Commission. And he was a planter here, growing tea like so many other British people. But unlike most of the British planters who sort of didn't really get involved with the native culture, John Still was fascinated by it. He was a hunter. He was out in the jungle hunting with the Vedda people, who are the indigenous tribal people who are very hard to find these days. But also he was interested in Sinhalese, which is the ethnic majority of the country, who are Buddhists, and he himself converted to Buddhism. But he was also very knowledgeable of the Tamil customs. The Tamils are the people who grow the tea here, the plantation Tamils. They were imported by my great-great-grandfather Norman Rousel of the Ceylon Labour Commission. He imported people like that to this area so that they could grow tea because there was a shortage of labour. The problem is that they were Hindu, and that's what led to the big war in this country. It didn't end until 2009 between the government, the Sinhalese government, and the Tamil Tiger rebels. There were actually Tamils here long before Norman Rousel started importing them, and the descendants of the Tamils who were here in the medieval times are known as Sri Lankan Tamils, whereas the Tamils who have been here for the last 150 years are not called Sri Lankan Tamils, even though they're Tamils and they're Sri Lankan. They're known as plantation Tamils to many. And the people of this part, the hilly country, these are these kind of Tamils, and they are actually integrated to some extent with the Buddhist majority, because as you can see from the shrine just here in this garden at this lovely colonial bungalow, there was images of both Buddha and Ganesh, and also a strange god who is unique to Sri Lanka, Kataragama Devio. Kataragama is also a town here, and in that town there is a shrine to this god of the Hindus, Kataragama. But Kataragama is also recognized as being holy by the Buddhists. The Buddhists believe he came from the Himalayas and that he now resides in the jungles of Sri Lanka where he meditates. But even Muslims and Christians think that town is holy. It's a bit like the Holy Mountain. Somehow the perennial philosophy has manifested in a tangible sense in these two locations in Sri Lanka, the Holy Mountains Triprada and the town of Kataragama. John Still, he wrote about this guy in his book, The Jungle Tide. This book was written in the 1930s. He remembered his 15-odd years that he spent in Ceylon, and very favourably, and he loved the jungles here. But he lamented the decline of the jungle. The British started cutting down forests up in these hills to grow coffee back in the 1860s, I think. And by the 1930s, when he was there, when John Still was writing this, obviously there was quite a lot of forest gone, but nearly every plantation you've seen in this film and everything you can see here is made after the British left, after Sri Lankan independence.
Particularly where the fauna was concerned, being a tree crop, there was still scope for wildlife to live within the tea. Particularly small animals like hare and porcupines and maybe barking deer. Those animals did survive quite well in tea plantations. The jungle fowl you get various little animals like that which are very commonly found in tea plantations. And also, I must say that most ravines were retained in their original form because they were good sources of water, and those remained untouched, and in fact some of those areas were left in the original jungle cover. The trees were not cut. Those areas, they held a lot of wildlife. The wild boar, the sambar. You got quite a few animals living in those little forest patches.
John Still was hoping that this whole area would become reclaimed by the jungle. Just as the Hindus believe in the eternal cycles of time, and similarly to more modern authors like Oswald Spengler, believe in civilizational cycles. Each civilization rises and falls. John Still's book has this theory of the jungle tide for Sri Lanka, where every single civilization that rises in this country, whether it be the Sinhalese one or the ones before that or the British and their tea, will fight against the jungle, cut it back, and then as their civilization declines and their power declines, the jungle will return. And this is like a tide, and that's what he meant. But he had a great appreciation, like I do, for jungles. And so he kind of, as a Britishman, he was lamenting the decline of the British Empire in the 30s, but also he accepted it as part of the cycles of time. Just as because he was an archaeologist, he uncovered some of the great discoveries. There is some amazing historical sites where you can see the Buddhist civilizations of the Sinhalese, and they'd been overgrown in jungle, and he encountered some of them when he was just hunting. Nowadays it's all tourist spot. You can get there by bus, and Japanese people, Chinese people go on pilgrimages to see these ancient Buddhist statues, huge Buddhist statues of Buddhas that were once overgrown, and the giant lotus bath, which was discovered by Still himself. A bit further south you have Sigiriya, the great rock. It's a mountain into which Buddhist monasteries were sort of carved into it, and inside you have these ancient frescoes of voluptuous women painted, which are of great historical importance and fascination to the Sri Lankans and to all the tourists who come here. And yes, John Still knew about these, and he knew that there was rather the Sinhalese people still here. They still speak Sinhalese and they still practice Buddhism. Their civilization had gone, and it had been grown over to the extent that they didn't even remember what it was, what the name of the city was that he was helping to discover. Even though there are ancient texts describing all the cities at that time, it wasn't until they found some inscriptions later on that they could identify which city it really was that they'd discovered. And that's the same thing happening here now. The British have left, and the British left in the 30s or 40s. Gradually after independence, they didn't really want to be living here with Sri Lankan masters, so off they went. Some to Kenya to grow tea there at a cheaper price, some back to Britain, and they passed on the industry and the civilization that they had built of the colonial civilization to the Sri Lankans, who took up that role. And Anglo-Sri Lankans like Kenneth Congreve and his father were in senior roles in the tea industry, and they preserved this culture of the bungalows, the tea estates with managers who oversee the plantation Tamils, a kind of hierarchical traditional society with routines, and also with social centres, churches, sports clubs that bring everyone together. And that sports club where I visited, I saw the photos of my ancestors. It's been there every year. People have been playing cricket and rugby there, and today you can't find a Sri Lankan, whether he be Sinhalese or Tamil, who doesn't love cricket. So the only real legacy we've left here is language, the English language, cricket and tea. But this tea industry is declining by about 30% every year, and there's new ways of doing things, new innovations in the tea industry, which means that some of the old tried and tested established orders of the industry that were invented by the British are being replaced, and many of the young lads who grow up on the plantations to pick tea aren't happy here. They want to move into the cities, Colombo, where they get mobile phones and a tuk-tuk driver taxi. They make less money than they would here. Probably they don't get the health services that's provided for all everyone here gets a house provided. They get the hospital service. They get all perfectly looked after an entire life. But it's not so exciting picking tea. So they want that. You know, they watch television, Bollywood movies, Hollywood movies. They want something else.
Also, working in the field, I think the younger generations link it with manual labor and with a lower dignity than what they really aspire to.
While it's sad this industry may decline, we may think that one day all this hillside will be covered in jungle again. John Still, he knew about the jungle gods that are very old and somehow integrated into Hindu and Buddhist cultures here. The Tamils have a jungle god called Ayanar, I think it's pronounced, who is still very popular here. The Ayanar cult is an ancient clan-based, Dravidian-based religion, so it's sort of pre-Indo-European Indian god, related to ancestor worship and to nature, the cult of nature itself. You can tell it's not like Hindu proper because there were, and still have been in recent times, blood sacrifices performed to him, a fertility god. So he probably had some similar role to Freyr in our own history. In the hills around Adams Peak, the local god takes the name of Saman. Farther north, in the Matali Hills, and for a long way down into the plain, it is Maneri Dale, and where I was camped, it was my old protector, Ayanar. I had been counted among his followers for some years, for those who would know the forests must not stop at the ways of beasts and the dialects of men, but must extend their study in all seriousness to the higher sphere of superhuman powers, or they will not be told the secrets they wish to learn. I've said already that the planters were stuffy, and sort of didn't, stuffy Anglicans who didn't want anything to do with these indigenous peoples or the Buddhists or the Hindus. So, but there were exceptions, of course, and some of them have become famous household names now. There was a young lad here who was a planter at the same time my family was here. Well, he wasn't a planter, he was a boy. His father was a planter. But when he grew up, he too became a planter. And he was fascinated by the practices of the native peoples in these hills. And when he grew up and went back to England after he had finished with his planting life, he began a new religion. And that religion was called Wiccanism, and his name was Gerald Gardner. He was by no means the only occultist or pagan person from around here, because Aleister Crowley was staying around here a bit. He spent some time here staying with Charles Henry Allen Bennett. Bennett was one of these instrumental figures in the history of Buddhism because he was a Westerner who was celebrating Buddhism. He'd originally been part of the Golden Dawn, and I think he switched from this kind of occultism to Buddhism instead, which he preferred. And another white man who converted to Buddhism, who was very important in Sri Lankan history, was the American by the name of Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. And he encouraged the Sinhalese of Sri Lanka to celebrate their Buddhist heritage and be proud of it, because some of them had been converting to Christianity under the British and under the Portuguese, and there was kind of an inferiority complex around that time. So this Yank kind of tried to get them all to be proud of it again, of being Buddhists. And him doing that was somewhat influential in the Sri Lankan nationalist movement, which was a big part of the independence movement after the Second World War. In most lands, archaeology deals with temples whose last worshipper died long centuries ago. No one now prays to Horus, or to Pallas Athene, not under that name. But here in the forest of Ceylon, the ruins we explore are those of a religion still living. To this day, the faith of the majority of the population. You can see how Ceylon and the interaction between the West and East through the British imperialism has facilitated a kind of, not only a revival of the indigenous Buddhism culture, but also it kind of influenced the Wiccanism and occultism and pagan revivals that happened in Britain.
and in the West, and as well the Buddhist conversions of Western people, which now, I mean, a lot of white people convert to Buddhism to make their parents angry or something, and they're not really Buddhists, but people like Olcott and Bennett were for real, and John Still as well. There was no, they understood the meaning of it. And I think, it's not long after this, the early 20th century, you get René Guénon and people like this who are dismissing the Orientalists and the anthropologists of the 19th century and really engaging with the meaning of Eastern culture, Hinduism, Buddhism, in relation to tradition and undying eternal orders and truths, which are really the only things that matter in any religion, whether we're practicing Christianity or reviving the old religions of our forefathers. For the jungle dissolves and recreates over and over and over again, as the Hindu philosophers perceived millenniums ago and built their religion on it. All that we know of things that died more anciently than a month ago is written in stone or brick or earthwork, or perhaps more durable even than these, in legend. One of the things I absolutely love about John Still and his insight into Sri Lanka and his theory of the jungle tide is that it's anti-progressive. He himself being part of this march of progress, the chopping down of the jungles, introduction of industry and such. Hydroelectric power came shortly after his time here. That was in the 40s, and these valleys were filled with lakes and things. Despite that, he recognized its impermanence and its relation in the cycles of history, and that to think anything else was quite futile and arrogant, in fact. And this is his last paragraph of his book, which I'd like to read. Visions of a regimented earth, where birds only sing by request, are to me so much more distasteful than the age-old struggle with the jungle tide, that I rejoice in an outlook that seems to the commercial utilizer of applied science horribly pessimistic. I do not think man will win final victory over the jungle, but rather that the battle will go on in the future as it has in the past, with alternating victories on either side, and with the tide of the jungle ever ready to rise and flow over civilization, whenever it grows too proud, too keyed on learning, as Spain once grew, or when it gets tired of exerting willpower, as we seem to be doing. But isn't it fascinating how he says, just as the British Empire was declining, that as we get tired of exerting willpower, that's really the mark of a dead civilization, when it no longer believes in itself.
Why do I pursue the details of my ancestral history? Why have these obscure details been revealed to me now? Fate, or my ancestors, bring it about that I meet now with long-lost blood relatives in the far-off part of the world close to the sun. This is so I can look at one part of our history, now fading and passing on, as countless others have before. John Still recognized this cycle of ages, and when I look at the ancient monuments of the Ceylonese, it is easy to forget that the Sri Lankan culture today is not the unbroken inheritor of these ruins. They were forgotten and claimed by the jungle for centuries before being rediscovered. Are we, then, the northern peoples, the same as those ancestors who built Stonehenge? Have we been so greatly changed by the ages that we would not recognize their faces? Can their ancient ways be reclaimed or understood through any means now available to us? I cannot answer these questions, and may never be able to, but I must endeavor to pursue the path I have chosen inexorably, to follow in the footsteps of my ancestors from centuries gone by, and thereby come closer to the truth so obscured in this age, but which was formerly known by all peoples in the ancient times, when tradition ruled.